Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Thursday's Theology. My name is Pastor Jeff, and I am your host. And before we dive into this week's character of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I actually just wanted to pause and talk a little bit about why I chose to do this series in the first place. And I think one of the main reasons that I chose to do this is because, one, I love comic books, but two, I think there's something to be said about the fascinating culture that's been created out of the MCU. And I was talking to somebody at the local comic shop about a couple weeks ago, and what he was saying is that there is actually a new renaissance of comic book readers, and he credited that largely to the introduction of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So you have all these new avid comic book readers coming into the culture and coming into the industry because of the movies. And I think that's great because I think it's taking comic books to an entirely new generation of readers, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. But I think what's going on here too is that we're fascinated with stories. I love comics because they tell a multitude of different stories from a multitude of different perspectives, and it's just fascinating to always be reading different people's stories from different backgrounds, from different circumstances, and how that translates into an actual comic book. So anyway, I wanted to do the theology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe because of the stories. The stories are fascinating, the characters are fascinating, and there's so much truth to be gleaned from those characters. So that being said, today we are going to talk about the theology found in the story of the Incredible Hulk. The Hulk is a fascinating character. And we really have two different characters wrapped into one. On the one hand, we have Bruce Banner, a soft-spoken scientist working towards breakthroughs in his research. And on the other, we have a rage-driven monster that smashes anything in its path. This character reminds me a lot of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I think is the point. But anyway, and the reason it reminds me of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is because it gives us a glimpse of how one man is torn between two realities. So anyway, it is pretty easy to find a theological theme in the Hulk's story simply because of the rage that drives him. Now, the Bible speaks at great length about the dangers of giving in to anger. And the reason being is because when you give in to anger, then there are all sorts of evil that can come from it. For instance, if we look at the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, we can see retributive justice at work. What that means is that if someone wrongs you, you can only seek retribution for the wrong committed against you. So, for instance, if someone steals your ox, then you can demand either payment for that ox or have that ox returned to you. So we can look at the Levitical and Deuteronomic law and say that it is kind of arcane, but it was light years ahead of what was going on around Israel. In other words, the reason God instructs Israel to only seek an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is because the accepted norm of justice was to seek personal vengeance that perpetuated a violent cycle. God is calling Israel to break that cycle by only seeking the same that was taken. If we look at the nations around Israel, we see that the practice of personal justice / vengeance was something like this. If someone stole your ox, you could go and steal their grain. Then they would come and burn your farm. Then you'd respond by killing their sons. Then they'd come back and kill your whole village, and the cycle of violence would continue. It was out of control. That is what makes the law of Israel so interesting, because it takes anger out of the equation. God sets the boundary for Israel by telling them they can only seek equal justice. The reason why this illustrates the story of the Incredible Hulk is because the Hulk leaves a path of destruction wherever he goes. When we allow our anger to take over, then we too will leave a path of destruction in our wake. Whether it is our relationships, our jobs, or our families, anger will destroy them. Anger drives vengeance. When anger goes unchecked, it can lead to unspeakable violence. As Jedi Master Yoda famously said, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. When anger leads to vengeance, the outcome is only suffering. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the story of the Incredible Hulk reveals the theology of anger. So thanks for joining me this week for Thursday's Theology. My name is Pastor Jeff, and I am your host. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.